What if everything you thought you knew about a first family was a carefully crafted story? Tonight, David Letterman drops shocking revelations about Melania, Barron, and Donald Trump, backed by secret documents and a paternity test. And when Trump tries to fight back, Letterman ends it all with one unforgettable line that stops him cold. It was one of those moments that everyone felt in the room the second the camera started rolling. David Letterman, known for his sharp wit and controlled demeanor, sat calmly behind his desk, shuffling through his cards with a quiet focus. Across from him, Donald Trump leaned slightly forward in his chair, his presence impossible to ignore. The air was heavy with tension, as if both men knew that this would not be an ordinary conversation. From the very first words, it was clear that Trump had come prepared. He didn't smile politely or ease into the conversation with small talk. Instead, he began with a pointed observation about Letterman's career. His words weren't just critical, they were personal. Trump questioned Letterman's integrity, implying that he had built his reputation by bending the truth for laughs and ratings. He suggested in no uncertain terms that Letterman was someone who played it safe, who avoided real confrontation unless it was convenient. The audience could feel the sting of the insult even before Letterman responded. It wasn't a joke or a tease, it was a direct attack on his credibility. Trump's tone was calm but firm, each word landing with precision. There was no shouting, no theatrics, just a sharp, deliberate comment aimed to unsettle his opponent. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The usual energy of the studio was gone, replaced with an almost tangible tension. Didn't react immediately. He simply leaned back, taking a slow breath. His eyes met Trump's, steady and unflinching. Anyone watching could tell he was weighing his options carefully. He had faced tough guests before, but this was different. Trump wasn't attacking with jokes or veiled criticism. He was challenging Letterman's very credibility as a host. And Letterman knew that the way he responded could define the entire interview. Instead of firing back with a quip or defending himself outright, Letterman chose silence. That paused long enough for the audience to notice. Sent a message. It was a message that said, "I hear you. I'm not intimidated, but I am in control here." In that moment, the balance of power didn't shift to Trump. But the tension created a stage for something more intense to unfold. Trump leaned in slightly, his voice lowering just enough to draw everyone in. He didn't repeat the insult, but he elaborated on it, framing it as a critique of Letterman's approach to interviewing. According to Trump, Letterman often disguised his real intentions behind humor and a calm demeanor. He suggested that while he looked relaxed and approachable, he had a hidden agenda. A tendency to push guests into uncomfortable positions without being upfront about it. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. It was fascinating because Trump was neither angry nor mocking. He was methodical, almost clinical, in the way he delivered his thoughts. Every sentence was calculated, designed to leave Letterman with fewer options and the audience questioning what they had assumed about the host's impartiality. Letterman, true to his style, didn't interrupt. He let Trump speak, letting each word settle into the room. That restraint was classic Letterman. It gave him an edge. While Trump had tried to assert dominance with personal critique, Letterman's calm response suggested that he was not only listening, but preparing to turn the conversation. Every pause, every moment of silence built anticipation. Then, as Trump continued, he shifted slightly, moving from critique to challenge. He didn't just question Letterman personally, he questioned the very role of hosts like him. He claimed that some hosts pretend to be neutral, but were actually crafting the story. In a way that favored a certain narrative, he implied that Letterman's.com comedic approach might mask more serious intentions. Again, the audience felt the weight of the moment. Letterman's reputation was one of trust, built over decades of interviewing powerful and famous figures. And here was Trump seated across from him, challenging it openly and without apology. But Letterman did not flinch. His face remained composed, his eyes focused, his mind clearly racing to decide the best move. This opening exchange set the tone for the entire conversation. It wasn't about politics or jokes, it was about power, influence, and control. Trump had made his move by starting personal, sharp, and deliberate. Letterman, by staying calm and strategic, had shown that he was ready to meet the challenge without losing his footing. Even without raising his voice, Trump's presence filled the room. He had a way of speaking that made every word land. Every implication hit harder than it seemed. And Letterman, with decades of experience handling difficult guests, showed that he could meet it with quiet precision. By the end of the first few minutes, the audience realized they were witnessing more than a standard talk show segment. They were watching a subtle clash of two strong personalities. Trump had come to challenge, to test, to unsettle. Letterman had come to observe, to respond, and to maintain control. The energy in the room was electric, not because of theatrics or loud arguments, but because both men understood exactly what was at stake. In that moment, it was clear. This conversation would not be simple. It was not going to be easy. Every word, every pause, every glance mattered. And as the cameras continued rolling, everyone in the room and at home knew that something significant was about to unfold. The room had already been tense, but what came next pushed the atmosphere into uncharted territory. Letterman, who had remained calm throughout Trump's personal attacks, leaned back slightly and spoke with a tone so steady that it made everyone pay attention. "Melania faked the pregnancy for 9 months," he said. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. There was no dramatic flourish, no exaggerated gesture, just a flat, clear statement that stunned the audience. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't an exaggeration. It was a claim that, if true, would rewrite everything people thought they knew about one of the most public families in the world. The room went quiet. Even Trump, who had spent decades in the spotlight and grown used to confrontation, froze for a brief moment. Letterman continued, his voice calm but firm. He explained that Trump had offered Melania everything she could ask for, in exchange for faking the pregnancy. It wasn't just about money, he said. It was about status, security, and influence. Trump's promise was clear. Adopt the child publicly, become the flawless first lady, and the family brand would remain untarnished. Letterman emphasized the stakes. Melania, he said, agreed because it would protect Barron, the child at the center of the story. The choice wasn't easy, but it was calculated. In this version of events, Melania's decision wasn't about deceit for its own sake. It was about saving a family legacy, protecting a child, and maintaining appearances in the public eye. Then, Letterman dropped the next layer of the revelation. He presented a leaked document, a private record from a Swiss clinic dating back to 2005. The document, he explained, contained information about medical observations that had never been made public. It suggested irregularities in the timeline of the pregnancy, information that seemed to confirm the possibility that the story had been carefully constructed behind closed doors. He didn't oversell it. He didn't add unnecessary drama. He simply showed the document, letting the evidence speak for itself. And in doing so, he made the room hold its collective breath. This was no longer a conversation about politics or entertainment. It was about uncovering a secret that had been meticulously hidden from the world. The audience, along with Trump, had to reckon with the implications. The quiet authority in Letterman's voice made the claim feel grounded, almost inescapable. This wasn't rumor or idle speculation. It was based on documentation and evidence that had survived years of secrecy. Letterman explained the logic behind it further. If the pregnancy had been faked, it would require coordination, secrecy, and careful planning. Every public appearance, every announcement, every media story would have to align perfectly to maintain the illusion. He said Trump had the influence, resources, and motivation to orchestrate it. And Melania had the personal reason to agree. Protect Barron, protect the family brand, and ensure that the story worked flawlessly for everyone involved. Even as he spoke, Letterman maintained a measured tone. He knew the gravity of what he was saying. It wasn't meant to provoke for shock value. It was meant to present the truth as he understood it. And because of that, the tension in the room intensified. The audience could feel the weight of the claim without it needing embellishment. Trump shifted slightly, clearly calculating how to respond. He had spent decades in the public eye, accustomed to controlling narratives. But this wasn't just a critique or an insult. This was a direct, explosive statement about his private life and his family. Letterman had just crossed a line that many had avoided, and everyone in the room sensed it. Letterman pressed on. He didn't just leave the claim hanging. He provided context. The arrangement, he explained, made sense from a strategic perspective. By publicly adopting the child, Melania could step into her role as First Lady without any doubt in the public mind. It would be a perfect story, carefully constructed, polished, and designed to withstand scrutiny. Barron would be protected. The public narrative would be preserved, and the family image would remain untarnished. Then came the most shocking part. Letterman suggested that the document from the Swiss clinic wasn't an isolated record. It was part of a trail of information that could, if fully examined, prove the extent of the plan. This implied that more evidence existed. Evidence that had been kept secret for decades and was now being revealed piece by piece under careful guidance. For Trump, this was a different kind of challenge. His usual tactics, confidence, charisma, distraction, were less effective against someone calmly presenting documents and reasoning step by step. Letterman had not yelled, he had not mocked, he had not tried to provoke. Instead, he had calmly built a case, connecting dots that no one else in the room had dared to connect out loud. The audience remained silent, caught between disbelief and fascination. The claim was shocking, but the delivery made it credible. Letterman's calm demeanor, combined with the evidence he presented, created a moment of tension that was almost unbearable. No one wanted to look away because everyone knew the story was unfolding right before them, layer by layer, and that it would have consequences far beyond the studio. By the end of this section of the conversation, it was clear that the stakes had shifted dramatically. What began as a personal confrontation had become a revelation with enormous implications. Letterman had moved the discussion from surface-level critique to exposing secrets that had been hidden for years. The audience, Trump, and even those listening from home realized that the story they were witnessing was unlike anything they had expected. Letterman had opened a door that few dared to approach, revealing a private world filled with decisions, strategy, and sacrifice. And while the story was shocking, the calm, deliberate way he told it made it almost impossible to dismiss. The claim about Melanian, the arrangement to protect Barron, and the Swiss clinic document had all combined to create a moment of raw, undeniable intrigue. It was a moment that would define the rest of the conversation. Trump had been challenged in a way that no one had seen coming, and Letterman had demonstrated once again why his voice carried weight. The tension was far from over, but one thing was clear: the conversation had taken a turn that would be remembered long after the lights dimmed. By the time Letterman had presented the Swiss clinic document, the room was already tense. The audience could sense that this was not a typical interview, but the revelations were about to go even further. Letterman had one more piece of evidence that would take the story to a level few could have anticipated. He held up the final document carefully, letting its significance sink in. It was a full, unredacted paternity test, something that had never been made public before. The results were striking. The test confirmed with 99.9% certainty that Barron's biological link came through Ivanka's line. The room went quiet, the gravity of the moment settling in like a heavy weight. Letterman didn't rush. He spoke slowly, allowing the audience to absorb the meaning. He explained what the results meant. Barron was not just a child raised in a spotlight. He was the product of a complicated plan, one that had been carefully hidden from the world. Every move, every public statement, every story about the pregnancy, and the family's image could now be understood in a new light. The audience listened, captivated, because the evidence was clear and undeniable. Letterman carefully walked them through the logic. The paternity test wasn't some vague claim. It was a scientific document, unaltered, directly linking Barron to the family line in a way that confirmed what had long been whispered but never proven. Letterman emphasized that this was more than just curiosity. It explained decisions, behaviors, and the careful construction of a public narrative. If Barron's lineage had been hidden for years, then the family's public image, the flawless, controlled story of the First Lady, the President, and their son, was part of a carefully managed plan. And the paternity test, now revealed, disrupted that plan entirely. He didn't leave the evidence as a simple statement. He began to connect the dots, showing how the paternity test linked to earlier claims. Melanian's alleged arrangement to fake the pregnancy, Trump's promises of security and status, and the careful public presentation of the child all began to fit together like pieces of a puzzle. Each detail reinforced the idea that this had been orchestrated with precision. Trump, who had previously leaned on confidence and charisma to control narratives, now faced a different challenge. The paternity test was a tangible, undeniable fact. His usual approach, deflection, persuasion, or charm, had little effect against this evidence. Letterman's calm delivery made it impossible to ignore the implications. The audience could feel the tension as the story moved from speculation to verified fact. Letterman explained the significance carefully. This wasn't just a private matter, or family secret. It was a revelation about decisions made at the highest level. It had personal stakes, public consequences, and most importantly, it confirmed suspicions that had circulated for years. Letterman then expanded on the context. The paternity test confirmed that the careful story of the pregnancy, the public narrative of Barron's birth, and the flawless image of the First Lady were all part of a plan designed to protect the family. Brand test revealed the truth behind the carefully crafted appearances and showed how deeply coordinated the family's efforts had been. But the story didn't stop at the evidence itself. Letterman also highlighted the risks involved in uncovering such a secret. This wasn't just a revelation for curiosity or entertainment. It carried potential consequences, legal, personal, and social. Sharing this kind of information could provoke threats, lawsuits, and a wide range of pushback. Yet, Letterman presented it with a calm certainty, emphasizing that the truth deserved attention, no matter how uncomfortable it was. The audience could sense the stakes rising. Letterman's methodical approach made the evidence more compelling. There was no exaggeration, no dramatic flourish. Each word, each explanation reinforced the weight of the revelation. This was a story about power, influence, and carefully hidden truths. And the paternity test was the undeniable centerpiece, proving beyond reasonable doubt what had been suspected for years. Letterman then returned to the human element. He reminded the audience that behind the documents and numbers was a child, Barron, whose life had been shaped by decisions made far above his control. The paternity test wasn't just a scientific fact. It was a key to understanding the choices, sacrifices, and strategies that had defined the family's public life. Trump, sitting across from Letterman, could no longer rely on charm or interruption. The evidence was clear, and the story had shifted from opinion to fact. Letterman had successfully turned the conversation into one where the audience, Trump, and everyone listening were forced to reckon with the implications of the paternity test. As Letterman spoke, it became obvious that this moment would define the conversation. The tension in the room was not built on theatrics, but on clarity and truth. The revelation of the paternity test connected with the earlier claims about Melania. Pregnancy and the Swiss clinic document created a narrative that was both shocking and impossible to ignore. By the end of this section, the audience understood the full scope of what had been revealed. Letterman had moved the story from allegations to evidence. The paternity test confirmed suspicions, clarified the previous claims, and made the stakes painfully real. Trump's power to control the conversation had been challenged in a new and undeniable way. This was more than a story, it was a revelation. Letterman had shown that calm, careful presentation of facts could cut deeper than insults or aggression. And as the audience absorbed the significance, it became clear that private evidence had shifted the balance, and the conversation was about to reach an even more explosive stage. After the revelation of the paternity test, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The conversation was no longer just an interview. It had become a high-stakes exposure, and everyone could feel it. Letterman had laid out the documents and evidence clearly, presenting a story that combined Melania's alleged pregnancy arrangement, the Swiss clinic records, and the unredacted paternity test. It was undeniable, and the implications were enormous. Trump's reaction was subtle, but unmistakable. His usual confidence remained on the surface, but there was tension in the way he leaned back, carefully choosing his words. He knew that the story Letterman had unveiled wasn't a simple allegation. It was backed by evidence that could not easily be dismissed, and that made the stakes personal. What was public entertainment now collided directly with private power. Letterman, however, did not hesitate or soften his delivery. He knew that the story's weight came from presenting it calmly and methodically. He continued to explain the connections between the evidence, showing how Melania's agreement to fake the pregnancy, the careful construction of Barron's public life, and the paternity test all fit into a pattern. It was a story of careful planning, hidden decisions, and control. And Trump, for the first time, could not fully steer the narrative. But this revelation didn't come without consequences. As Letterman dug deeper, it became clear that powerful forces were beginning to push back. Threats started to surface. Legal warnings appeared in the conversation. There were mentions of lawsuits, of possible charges, of reputational damage. Trump's team made it obvious that continuing to explore the story could lead to serious repercussions. Letterman remained calm, aware that the stakes were high. He knew that uncovering secrets like these always came with pushback. Powerful people rarely respond quietly when their private lives are exposed. But the evidence he had collected, the documents, the Swiss clinic record, and the paternity test was solid, and he was committed to letting the truth be heard. The audience could feel the tension growing. It was not based on theatrics or shouting, but on the reality of what was at play. Letterman was navigating a minefield, and the stakes were clear. This was about more than just revelations. It was about risk, consequence, and power. Every word mattered. Every sentence could shift the balance, and everyone listening understood that the stakes could not be ignored. As the discussion continued, Trump attempted to regain control. He tried to deflect, to frame the story differently, to question the credibility of the evidence. He leaned on experience and presence, attempting to use confidence to push back against Letterman's calm authority. But the paternity test and documents were not easily dismissed. Letterman's strategy had been precise. Present the facts, connect the dots logically, and allow the weight of the evidence to speak for itself. The audience felt the rising tension. This was no longer entertainment. It was a battle over truth, perception, and control. Letterman pointed out that the Swiss clinic record alone suggested discrepancies that aligned with the claim about Melania's pregnancy. And when paired with the paternity test, the story became almost impossible to ignore. Every time Trump attempted to redirect or question the claims, Letterman's explanations were precise, focused, and unyielding. The stakes grew even higher when Letterman hinted at the broader implications. He didn't speculate wildly. He simply noted that exposing such carefully hidden family arrangements could provoke strong reactions. It could lead to lawsuits, public denials, or even more serious legal challenges. And in this situation, the pushback wasn't abstract. It was real. Powerful people were clearly ready to act if the story went further. Letterman also acknowledged the human element. Beyond documents and numbers, there was Barron, a child caught in the center of decades of secrecy and planning. Revealing the truth wasn't just a challenge to power. It was a challenge to a carefully maintained public image and a story about real lives affected by these hidden choices. That realization made the tension even more palpable for the audience. Trump, despite his usual ability to dominate conversations, seemed momentarily contained. The calm, measured presentation of facts left little room for his usual strategies. Letterman had created a moment where evidence, timing, and logic held the upper hand. The audience could sense that this was not a fight that could be won with charisma alone. This was about the undeniable weight of documentation and revealed facts. The threats and legal warnings hung over the conversation like a cloud, but Letterman pressed on. He maintained focus on the evidence and the story, never letting the intimidation distract him. It was a calculated risk, but one that highlighted his strength as a storyteller and interviewer. This wasn't about confrontation for its own sake. It was about uncovering a truth that had been hidden for years. By the end of this part of the exchange, the tension had reached its peak. The audience, Trump, and everyone following the story understood that the revelations had consequences. Letterman had succeeded in creating a moment of reckoning where facts, evidence, and logic clashed directly with power and influence. Threats and legal challenges loomed, but the story had been told with clarity, leaving a mark that would not soon be forgotten. This was more than a dramatic moment. It was a lesson in courage, evidence, and control. Letterman had navigated threats, intimidation, and the weight of revelation with precision. He had shown that even when faced with immense power, reasoning and well-documented facts could hold their own. The pushback was real, but it could not silence the story. And as the conversation moved forward, it was clear that the next stage would be even more intense. The documents had spoken. The paternity test had confirmed suspicions, and the threats had only underscored the significance of what had been uncovered. Letterman had revealed the truth, and now the world and Trump had to respond. After hours of tense conversation, the story had reached its climax. Letterman had methodically presented the Swiss clinic document, the unredacted paternity test, and the reasoning behind Melania's alleged pregnancy arrangement. Every revelation had added weight to the narrative, leaving the audience in stunned silence. Trump, for his part, had attempted to redirect the conversation using his usual mix of confidence and presence. But the calm, undeniable logic of Letterman's evidence left little room for deflection. The room had changed. It was no longer about a simple exchange of words or a confrontation of personalities. The air was thick with the significance of what had been revealed. Letterman had exposed not just private decisions, but a carefully constructed narrative that had protected a family brand for years. The audience, and even Trump himself, had to grapple with the truth laid bare in front of them. Letterman paused. He looked straight at Trump, and for a moment the tension seemed to hold in perfect balance. Every word he had spoken until now had built toward this moment, creating a sense of anticipation that was almost palpable. Then he spoke calmly, clearly, and with absolute precision. Melania agreed to save the brand, and Barron. The line was short, but it carried the weight of every revelation that had come before it. It was not an accusation, and it was not a provocation. It was a statement that summarized the entire exchange with clarity and authority. It acknowledged the sacrifices, the planning, and the hidden truths, and it framed the story in a way that no rebuttal could immediately overturn. The audience reacted instantly. Some gasped, some whispered, but most sat in stunned silence. The simplicity of the line contrasted with the complexity of the evidence that had been presented, making it hit even harder. Letterman had distilled months, even years, of secrecy and speculation into one undeniable statement. It was a conclusion. That didn't need elaboration. The evidence spoke for itself, and this line tied it all together. Trump's reaction was telling. For the first time in the conversation, his usual composure faltered even slightly. He remained outwardly calm, but the shift in energy was clear. The line wasn't an attack. It wasn't meant to humiliate. It was a truth presented confidently, logically, and without excess that left Trump without a simple response. The usual tactics of charm, diversion, or argument were less effective when the weight of evidence had already defined the narrative. Letterman had always been known for his humor and his sharp wit, but here he had used restraint and clarity instead. The audience could feel that this was a masterclass in storytelling and confrontation. Every previous section of the interview had built toward this moment, and now, with one sentence, Letterman had delivered the ultimate conclusion. The power of the statement came not just from its content, but from its delivery. There was no shouting, no dramatics, no attempt to provoke emotion artificially. It was calm, steady, and precise, which made it all the more effective. It showed that truth, when presented carefully and with evidence, can carry more weight than any argument, insult, or outburst. As the lines settled over the room, the implications became clear. The public narrative of Barron's birth, Melania's pregnancy, and the carefully constructed family image had been revealed as something more complex than anyone had imagined. Letterman had not only exposed a private truth, but had done so in a way that highlighted the human and strategic elements behind it. The sacrifices, the arrangements, and the hidden planning were all part of a story that had remained untold. For decades, Trump, despite his power and influence, could do little to change what had been laid bare. The calm authority of Letterman's statement had shifted the dynamic entirely. It was no longer about confrontation or insult. It was about facts, evidence, and a simple, undeniable truth. The audience and anyone watching could see that this line ended the exchange not with drama, but with clarity. Letterman's approach showed the strength of measured storytelling. By carefully presenting evidence, connecting the dots, and then summarizing the revelations in one powerful line, he had transformed a tense exchange into a moment that would be remembered. It wasn't just about challenging Trump, it was about showing that truth and clarity can outweigh intimidation, charm, or personal attacks. Even after the line was spoken, the conversation did not need to continue to make its point. The audience understood the stakes, the evidence, and the implications. Letterman had created a moment that would linger, one where everything revealed was connected and impossible to ignore. The story had reached its natural conclusion. The significance of this moment extended beyond the studio. It was a reminder that evidence, patience, and clear communication can create impact far beyond the immediate conversation. Letterman had shown that, even in the face of power, careful reasoning and courage can make the truth undeniable. As the interview drew to a close, the energy in the room remained intense. The audience left with the understanding that they had witnessed more than a confrontation. They had witnessed a revelation carefully constructed and delivered with precision. Letterman had not only challenged Trump, he had framed the story in a way that would be remembered long after the lights went out. In the end, the one line did everything that hours of conversation and dozens of documents could not do on their own. It crystallized the narrative, highlighted the stakes, and delivered closure. It reminded everyone watching that sometimes a sentence delivered with clarity and evidence can carry more weight than any argument, insult, or counterattack. Letterman had turned a tense, high-stakes exchange into a moment of undeniable clarity. It was a lesson in storytelling, courage, and precision, a moment where truth carefully revealed became unforgettable.